We cannot be satisfied with empty talk. So far, all we've heard is talk about the need to come up with some kind of truce. And it's not particularly hidden that this truce is needed in order to gain time to continue pumping weapons into Ukraine. A truce is a road to nowhere. We need legal agreements that will fix all the conditions for ensuring the security of the Russian Federation, in a context that will secure the impossibility of violating these agreements in an internationally legal manner.
That was Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov just hours ago, having a little sit down with reporters in a very public way, talking about after Christmas what is expected once Trump hits office. That's one of the things that was the central point of his remarks today. A lot of people thinking, hey, Trump's coming in, he's going to have a negotiated settlement. There's been all this talks about some people in Europe, what they're saying. Some leaders say this, some leaders say something different. Zalinsky says something different than all of them. But everybody's like, yeah, but what about Trump? Because he's the one that's going to be calling the shots on the Western side anyway. And what about his call that he's going to end the war in a day, et cetera? So he was asking a lot of those questions today. And some of his answers, I think, are very, very telling and can really help people get an understanding, especially if you kind of parse some of his words and compare it to things he said and done in the past, things that he has said and things that have worked out. Also, kind of gives you a pretty good idea of what may be coming in the future. Now, one of the things about Sergey Lavrov, as opposed to nearly anybody else who's got a role to play in these things, is we've got like 2 full decades of time for him as Russia's foreign minister. So we got a pretty good read on what he means when he says certain things and what kind of flexibility they're going to have. He has always been, well, I'll say a straight shooter from a Russian perspective. I mean, everybody, it's not like everything he says is true. Everybody mixes in information with deception, with misinformation to try and achieve an outcome of their side. But I think that it's fair to say that as a diplomat, he is one of the best in the world that we've seen in a century or so. And really, when you just strip away the nationalities, and there's been some really good ones in the United States in decades gone by, that achieve the same kinds of results and use some of the same kinds of patterns. But the bottom line is that they speak in a diplomatic way. They seek a genuine outcome that's beneficial. And as he said in some parts of this interview here today, that he's looking for not just things to work out the Russian way, though he did reiterate in that clip right there that his primary consideration, as every nation's foreign minister or secretary of state ought to be, for Russia's interests. He wants to guarantee Russian security. But what differentiates him in one way from anyone on the Western side is that he also says, and we want a reasonable outcome that will take care of the valid, legitimate security interests of all the nations involved, to include Ukraine, to include Eastern European states that may border them, et cetera. So he's got an open mind that says, hey, we're willing to have some negotiated settlement. But he said a number of things in here which are really important, and we have to understand for setting expectations. Because if you have one set of expectations and you go in and those aren't met, then that can lead to real disappointment, and it can complicate the process of reaching a negotiated settlement. I think that's probably the reason why Lavrov made these very public statements here. We can assume that behind the scenes there's additional diplomacy going on where he's saying things behind the scenes, but he is saying this one in the open so that everybody understands where the Russian position is. And if there's one thing that has been really true for the most part since even before this began, all throughout his term, but certainly during the nearly 3 years of this war between Russia and Ukraine, is that he's been pretty candid about being sincere and being genuine with what's real on the ground, where Russia can go, where they may want to go, where they don't want to go, et cetera. So we can take with a certain grain of sand, I think, or grain of salt, sorry, is probably a good way to put it. But this is a good basis for trying to see what is possible. Now, the next thing that he was talking about was that he's honestly identifying what's going to be difficult on the U.S./the Western side of these negotiations because of the dominance that we have enjoyed for the last 50 years. This is something we've talked about on our show as well. We've acknowledged that there is a real challenge for those in the West. Because really, since 1992, since the Soviet Union disintegrated, since the Warsaw Pact dissolved and fell apart, that we have basically been able to do whatever we want in international affairs. If we want to go and do this, and we don't care if our friends, allies, adversaries, or enemies like it, we just do it. And no one could do anything about it, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. We just did whatever we wanted. When we were expanding NATO, Russia didn't like it, but they were so weak and powerless, they could do nothing about it. So we went ahead and moved on forward. When the 2003 invasion into Iraq, for example, even though our staunchest allies, especially in France and Germany, were adamantly opposed to that war, George Bush didn't care. He said, you're either with me or you're against me, and we're going to go do whatever we want to do. And then they made up this whole thing about weapons of mass destruction, and in we run, and taking care of all that in Russia, in Iraq. And then, of course, it hasn't been much different since that time. We had 20 years of disaster in Afghanistan war because we just said whatever we wanted to be true, because the Taliban, though they can't march on us, they can't defeat our forces in the field, they also can't be defeated if they were willing to pay a price, which they demonstrated with much blood that they were. And then they're starting to get into the problem that we could spin things left and right all day long, which we did for all 20 of those years, or certainly the last 15 in particular. We just said what we wanted to be true, and no one knew it was any of the wiser in the West. In fact, we just, at the end of it, when it collapsed, we just blamed it on this person or that person or this whatever, but we weren't wrong. It's just that somebody else was to blame, fill in the blank. It doesn't matter who. But here's the thing. The American public, they never saw American forces fleeing the battlefield. They never saw, defeat and return from failure, etc. We still, even in the last days, when the Taliban had already taken over the capital city of Kabul, we were on the key international airport, getting the last of the folks out that we were going to. They didn't stop us. They didn't have the capacity. Had they opened up on our troops or tried to start attacking, we could have brought in so much air power and just absolutely annihilated all the Taliban that they were there in the capital and just, turned it into rubble like Israel's doing. We could have done the same thing. But the downside of that happening is that, yes, that was, put as good a face on a bad withdrawal as you could have, because other than the one big terror strike where there was a bomb that killed 13 Marines and like 200 Afghanistan civilians, other than that one mass casualty event, it was relatively benign. And, we had the iconic picture, which Gary showed, a lot of the people trying to jump on the airplanes that left. That was a really ugly scene. But by and large, it didn't change anything reality. Well, now then, Lavrov's trying to say, okay, that has worked, relatively speaking, for you up to this point, because it hasn't been, any of these things haven't been significant. You lied about the Iraq war, but Iraq was too weak to do anything about it anyway, so there's really no consequence. Afghanistan, I just told you, all those things. So it doesn't really change anything for your people. This one is not going to be that way, because you can't spin your way out of this one because of the realities on the ground. And so Lavrov said this about, worried about how the West might have to respond.
So a multipolar world definitely would take for granted that the Western colleagues also participate without a doubt. But how can they position themselves, whether they will get through that psychological loss of domination that they enjoyed for half a century? All of that depends on their political culture and their real sound understanding of their place in this real life, and their ability to act accordingly, in accordance to their new situation.
Now, when he says react according to the new situation, he's basically saying, hey, you can pretend it's still 1991 all you want in your head and in your own mind and in the world that you create for your spin, whatever. Maybe that works on your domestic audiences. It did in Iraq. It did in Afghanistan. This is a different deal. So it's going to be really difficult for the West to spin this into anything besides what it is, especially as I showed you. Let me see if I might happen to. No, I don't believe I have it handy. In one of the shows we did, I think right before Christmas, I showed you a map of the battlefield. Russia has said what their minimum requirements are, which is the 4 oblasts that they illegally annexed in 2022. And on that map, you can see there are 3 huge grayed areas where the Ukraine side still owns it. They have their troops there. They have their citizens there, etc. What Vladimir Putin has said in June 14th of this summer, what Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said just 2 or 3 weeks ago, reiterated that then, and now to hear Lavrov implies the realities on the ground. That's a phrase they use a lot. Whatever the negotiations are, they have to acknowledge and represent realities on the ground. And in their view, they have defined that as all 4 of those oblasts. And when you see there is huge patchworks of area where they have designated is something that that's their minimum necessary. So how is the West going to deal with a situation to where they want, at the worst, just to freeze it on the current lines? They want a ceasefire where the front lines are right now, and then they want to negotiate an end to just stop it right there. Russia has said, and Lavrov here appears to be signaling, that you need to understand the current line of communication, the current line of contact is not going to be the final line of negotiations. And that could also be one of the big reasons why he started off that conversation that we just saw here, saying a ceasefire is a road to nowhere. Because that's not going to, this is not, ceasefire where the lines are now is not where the final line is going to be. And then here he adds to that by saying, we have to recognize, you have to recognize that the realities on the ground are going to be over here. And how are you going to respond to that in the West? Just imagine how this is going to go down for Donald Trump, because he has to somehow pitch to the West and pitch to his own people, and definitely to his detractors who are already gleefully looking for ways to sabotage anything he tries to do anyway, just because that's how the American polity works these days, unfortunately. They used to say foreign policy is where all the bitterness, acrimony stops, and everybody has a genuine singular view when it comes to anything beyond our shores. That's gone. Just forget about that. We've seen that for both parties do the same, so we can expect that more of that here. But how is Trump going to say, okay, when I take office, the lines are going to be roughly where they are now? They'll probably be still a little bit further. There may be a few more big chunks taken in the Pokrovsk area, possibly in the Kupiansk area. There's some weakening of the lines there. The Kursk area in Russia continues to shrink, and the more Ukrainians die there, they lose territory every day. But it'll be, relatively speaking, that'll be close to where it is now. But those patchworks that I've talked about are going to be substantial areas. How is Trump going to say, all right, I've reached negotiated settlement that's going to take the lines where they are on the day I took office and move them to the West and hand those to Russia? Already, the people, especially his political opponents in the United States, are already sharpening the knives and saying, well, you can't just hand over to Putin because you're his acolyte, you're his, his patsy here in the United States, and you're just going to give it to him. So he'll face a lot of that criticism. And if you know anything about Trump, he doesn't do criticism well. But that's one thing he's going to have a hard time negotiating. And so will all the West. Certainly Keir Starmer and the leader of France, Macron. They've been outspoken and talking all the time about maybe even sending our troops there as part of a peacekeeping force, et cetera. And I showed you Starmer, I think barely a week ago, where he was standing on the deck of a warship and saying, we have got to keep going so that Ukraine prevails and they cannot lose. Just ridiculous stuff. How is that helping your own people when you still keep making those kinds of comments, and the BBC and Sky News and all these other faithfully share on with the audience there in the UK, and they still hear like there's some real chance for the Ukraine side to win, and then all of a sudden, here comes the negotiated deal that moves it way to the West, the areas that they never even fought over, that Russia is going to get all of those territories. That's going to be a tough sell. But there isn't a response to that Lavrov had. But first of all, I want to touch specifically on the issue of Trump coming in. That was another thing he directly addressed in here, was that, yeah, but Trump's coming on January 20th. Won't that make a big difference from what we have now? Here's what Lavrov said.
So a multipolar world definitely would take for granted that the Western colleagues also, but we never cherish any hopes or illusions. Speaking about this or that president will take office on the 20th of January. we will wait and see till the new administration is sure about its policies, is positive about its policies, and sets them forth. We know that there is Russophobic bipartisan consensus in the United States, and irrespective of a party allegiance, the ruling elites will promote and pursue their policies of weakening Russia, being their competitor.
And so you see there that, let's see, sorry, see Gary popped up something there as Ukraine marks Christmas. Exhausted soldiers wonder if Trump can end the war. Yeah, that's something even on the Ukraine side that they're wondering, is Trump going to end some of our troubles here? And as I've told you, I think I said in one of the previous articles that I had heard a note from somebody who has direct access to people on the front lines in the Ukraine side. And he said that for the first time in this nearly 3 years, he sees a lot losing hope, which they had never seen before. And so that kind of matches what we see here. All of that is factoring into how this negotiation is going to work. But you heard Lavrov on that last point there talking about the ruling elite in the United States. The reason why he says we're not all that concerned, frankly, with whether it's this president or that president on January 20th, they do care. They truly do have a position. They would much rather have the possibility of a Trump who is openly willing to negotiate and discuss, rather than Kamala Harris, who would said, hey, we're going to keep on going. Just it's going to be basically Biden part 2 with no change. So they do prefer that. But what they recognize, and Lavrov here is addressing, behind the scenes, that he says that there's this foreign policy elite in the United States that really is above partisan level. It's not even bipartisan. It's just beyond partisan, to where they don't want any kind of negotiation. They just want perpetual conflict. They just want to not do diplomacy, not in the traditional real sense, but only in the sense that you do what we say. If we talk and we can get you to do what we say, that's cool. And if not, we'll kill you and we'll bomb you into smithereens or so. That's not genuine diplomacy. That's not statecraft. And so Russia has seen a lot of that play out over the years, and they're concerned about that. And I do have that map here. I want to pull this up and show you, because this is what Trump is going to be facing here. You see all of these grayed out areas right here. You see that is a huge amount of area. And this is obviously the Eastern Front here. All of this stuff, according to what Putin has said, what Peskov has said, and what Lavrov has implied in this meeting here, all of this stuff has to go to the Russian side. And so you see in this area, look at this. I mean, this is why it's going to be even harder than some people think. All of these fortifications in this area, those are all fortifications. You see all the ones that are here that Russia has penetrated. You see, for the most part, 2024, the year 2024 took them to this far to go here. It was a lot of tough sledding for the Russian side in here. And you see down in the Pokrovsk area, this one right here, this is what we talk about a whole lot. You see there's still lots of fortifications in this area here. And not as much, but actually still a fair amount down here. And there hadn't hardly been any Russian advances militarily down here. This is stuff that the Ukraine side could hold on to for a long time. Maybe it takes another full year to go through if Ukraine could maintain the support, if Ukraine could maintain the troop numbers. And it's the reason why I say so often, folks, it's about men, not money, not machines, not about ammunition. All those things you have to have them all. But if you had lots of money, lots of machines, and lots of ammunition, but you didn't have lots of trained military personnel, all the other three categories don't matter. And Russia has more of every category. They have more, potentially millions more men from which to choose. So I think that what Lavrov is telling you here, and if you look at the map, and if you look at the overall map, and I'm talking the strategic landscape of the industrial capacity, of the manpower pools, of the political will, because people like to talk about how strong it is on the Ukraine side, justly so, because it's accurate that they have strong political will. Hence is the reason why after 3 full years of war, they have continued to maintain their viability. And truly, from a certain perspective, they deserve a lot of credit for that. But the reason why I put a caveat on that and say they deserve some credit for it, because that mentality, if it doesn't acknowledge reality on these other categories I just spoke to you about, then it's all you're going to do by continuing to exploit that willingness to fight and that political will. is to get more of your people killed, but you won't change the outcome, because what's not talked about as much on our side anyway is the political will on the Russian side, which is equal to it. Now, I know a lot of people in the West don't accept that. They don't want to accept it. But the fact is that the Russians do view this as an existential threat. This is not analogous to the United States and Vietnam in the 1970s. And it was this foreign war that we didn't need to fight anyway. And there was protest and all this stuff. And, you know, we just needed to get out of it. Nixon eventually did because it was just a waste of time, blah, blah, blah. That was something radically different. And some people in the West, unfortunately, hearken to that, thinking that, well, we can do the same to the Russians. If we just make it painful enough, if we just keep on helping the Ukraine side, the people will just get tired of it, recognizing that it's a ridiculous war that they shouldn't fight anyway. Well, that only works if it is a ridiculous war that the people don't care about. That is not the case here, because very much unlike Vietnam in the 1970s, this is on the front doorstep. This is more like if it was Mexico in the 1970s and we had been fighting this tough war. I assure you, nobody in America would be wanting to just quit if there was an active war going on our border against Mexico. We would never have done it. Russia's never going to do it, I mean, especially because they have nuclear weapons, etc. So that is the reality that Lavrov was talking about. And that is why it's going to be so hard for Trump when he's coming in here. But still, at the end, Lavrov said, in this last piece I want to show here, that he said, listen, we want a negotiation settled. And here's something also important to understand. Russia's in the driver's seat, but they don't have all the cards. Their other side does have cards. Trump does have cards. Zalinsky does have some cards, so fewer than anybody else. But they do exist because Russia doesn't want to, on that map I just showed you, they don't want to spend all of 2025 having to physically conquer all that stuff. So they have incentive and motivation to reach a negotiated settlement. As long as we can understand it's gonna come out on their side, but then there's motivation because Russia is already looking beyond the end of the negotiations. And we need to start doing the same thing too. Here's the inescapable truth. Once this negotiation has come to its end, whether that's something that happens in a month after Trump comes in, or if it could drag out another year of war, however it does, it's going to end. Russia will still be where they are. Europe will still be where it is. The U.S. will still be in existence where it is, as long as we don't get stupid and it goes to nuclear war, in which case, well, it won't matter anyway. But as long as we avoid nuclear war, all those things are going to exist. And we're going to have to learn how to get along. We're going to have to learn how to coexist, whether anyone on either side of that line divide likes it or not. And many don't like it on either side. But it doesn't matter. We're going to have to. Lavrov spoke about that too.
So if the messages that we can hear from the new Washington team to restore the dialogue that was cut off by Washington after the start of a special military operation, if all of that is in earnest, we will respond positively. But the Americans were the ones to sever the dialogue, so they take into account our legitimate interests in Washington. The dialogue will bear fruits and will not be useless. Otherwise, things will remain as they are.
Okay, that last phrase there was way more important than a lot of people may recognize. If we can have a negotiation to where our legitimate security interests are taken care of and your security interests are taken care of, then we're open to dialogue, i.e. we're willing to give and take. This is not just a declaration of here's the line, either give me everything I ask or pound sand. They're not saying that. They are willing to negotiate. Ergo, he recognized and acknowledged that our side does have some cards to play. But that last phrase is so important because he said otherwise things will continue as they are, i.e. they have the capacity, they have the will, and they have the ability to continue the war. So if Trump is thinking he is going to come in, if the Western leaders thinking, okay, well, Trump's a good negotiator, he's going to come in and he's going to forget about this June 14th declaration by Putin about those 4 oblasts. He can negotiate it where the current line of contact is, so we can keep those. If you think that, then we're just going to trend toward another year of fighting potentially, if the Ukraine side can maintain that, because it by all accounts appears very clear that the minimum that Russia will accept is all four of those oblasts, which means all those thatched gray areas I just showed you on the map, which are huge in comparison to what has already been captured by the Russian side. And that is going to be enormously difficult for anybody in the West to accept. But the Russians, I think, are very clearly saying, and I think all evidence shows that they are preparing for these negotiations not to succeed. I think that they are preparing to continue to move methodically forward until they seize on the ground the reality that Putin, that Lavrov, that Peskov, they keep talking about. That is what they mean. And they will continue to go. What is unknown is if they continued fighting. And see, then that puts Trump in a really awkward position, because now then he's going to have to say, okay, well, I've said that, the support for Ukraine is going to dry up, and we're not just going to keep shoveling all this stuff into an empty grave and to just throwing it away, that we're not going to have it either. But what if he doesn't get that negotiation he wants and the Russians keep going here? Is he going to literally, take the lifeline away and make it even easier for Russia to go forward? Or is he going to come under enormous pressure? And he will, mark this down, I'll say this is as close to a fact as you can get. He will come under a lot of pressure from both his own party and the Democratic Party to say, okay, if Putin's not willing to be reasonable, then what we need to do is open up the floodgates. You may remember, Gorka said when he was first named as a special advisor to Trump, he went on TV and said, yeah, Trump will say that whatever has been given through the last 3 years will be chicken feed or peanuts compared to what he can bring in there. So he's already put that, planted that seed that maybe we'll give even more than the Biden team did. Maybe he will. He'll certainly come under pressure to do that. That won't change the outcome, because now then that would then raise it up another notch, and then it would give more impetus. And by the way, everything has action-reaction situation. Nothing is neutral in any side here. If Trump does that, if negotiations are going in that direction, then that's going to give ammunition to those hardcore guys on the Russian side who say, okay, you wouldn't negotiate this deal that Putin offered? Okay, we're not going to just drive to the boundaries on that. Let me pull that back up and show you one more time. So here's what some people in Russia are already saying. If you read a lot of the Russian channels, they will say, okay, we're not just going to drive here and then stop. They say, if you force this, if you won't negotiate that, we'll go here. We'll go to the Dnieper River and we'll take all this. We'll take Kharkiv City. We'll take Odessa down here on the port. Completely cut off their access to any port at all and make Ukraine a landlocked state. That is the risk that Trump will face if he doesn't agree to the negotiated settlement there. If he doesn't agree to this, if Russia keeps on winning, they may not stop at those 4 oblasts. There's every reason to think they would continue on, because here's what it looks like from the Russian side. And you can hate Russia, but you must look at it from their perspective if you want an outcome beneficial to your side. If Russia does not get what it wants here, and they can't get through negotiations, those 3 thatched areas I showed you, and now then they're forced to take them militarily, then Putin will have to calculate how much more did that cost me in national treasure, ammunition, physical infrastructure, and men. How much more Russian blood did these guys force on me to expend in order to get that territory? And am I just going to stop right there? Because I assure you, as weakened as the Ukraine military is now, if somehow the fighting continues to go on there, there will come a point to where the Ukraine army just, the fabric becomes so weak that it ceases to exist as a viable entity. And you may have pockets hang on here and there, but the fabric of the force itself will rip and shred. And then Russia has the ability to just drive across Ukrainian territory. I just showed you a minute ago all the defensive fortifications in those areas. Once they get through those, though you would expect them to try and create new ones, they won't have time to create really good ones. And it's hard to imagine that the manpower alone on the Ukraine side, even if Russia's casualties are equal to the Ukraine side, it's unlikely that they would be able to continue defending, and that in any case, whether sooner or later or much later, at some point, Russia's going to be able to just drive across Ukraine. and then possibly take everything up to the Dnieper River. And, it's a massive amount of area there that isn't even at play right now. That's what people in the West don't understand. You're thinking it's just between either the current line of contact or that thatched area, and we're just negotiating in between those two. But if you don't agree to the thatched areas, see, that's the difference in mentality and talk about setting expectations. There are too many in the West that think that the line of contact is what we're negotiating over. Russia is signaling to you they're not thinking about that line. That's not their entry level. Their entry level is the end of the thatched area. So if you have two different understandings about where the beginning point is, then you can see where you're going to have a lot of trouble getting to an end, of course. So we have to recognize that that's the case. And unfortunately, it's a mixed bag, I'll say, as you're about to see here. There are some on the West who absolutely get everything I just said and maybe even have a deeper understanding than I do. But there are some that don't. And at the leader of the don't category is Vimir Zalinski, who said a couple of days ago, said this.
Москва слів не розуміє, але повинна відчувати силу. Мир завдяки силі можливий. І ми зробимо все, щоб миру досягти. Ще одне щодо Словаччини. Багато питань журналістів сьогодні про поїздку Фіцо в Москву. Насправді, після нашої розмови в Брюсселі, в присутності всіх лідерів Європи, нічого не дивує. Ми боремось заради життя. Фіцо бореться заради грошей. Причому навряд чи заради грошей для Словаччини. Тіньові домовленості з Путіним – це або торгівля державними інтересами.
Okay, that is some really personal, direct attacks against the head of a European state, Slovakia, Robert Fico. And if you're not tracking on the situations going on there, there has been a long simmering debate between Fico and Zalinsky, between their two countries over transit routes of Russian oil. See, what a lot of people are not aware of, hardly anybody in the West is aware, but even though we have this line of contact and this war that's been going on for nearly 3 years, there's still Russian oil going to the West. There still is. And a lot of it's going through Ukraine to the West. It's kind of weird how it's worked out because it's been shut off in some, but it hasn't been shut off in others. There was recently a deal finally struck between Hungary with Viktor Orban and Zalinsky and Putin and all that. So that actually is worked out. But for some reason, the one in Slovakia couldn't be worked out. Now, when Zalinsky is talking about it, and in that same interview, he blasted Fico for quite a number of things and said that he's lying about this and that. And for Fico's part, what he said is, we tried to work out a negotiated settlement with Ukraine. You wouldn't have it. And the way that you wanted it to be is that it was going to hurt us economically and hurt our country. And he said, I can't have that. So he went to Russia, met with Putin, and apparently they were going to be able to work out some kind of deal that's financially worthwhile for Fico. Now, Fico, for his part, I'm going to show you one of the ex-foreign ministers who was interviewed about this a couple of days ago, explaining how things look at from Fico's perspective. But let me show you a little bit, or tell you a little bit more about Zalinsky's point of view, because he's blasting Fico for doing something that's economically beneficial for his country, and of course he's insulting him by saying it's for personal gain because he's trying to shame him into doing something he wants. But here's the thing: Zalinsky's cutting his own throat financially as well. So obviously they're trying to get money for operating and stuff from the West, etc. But unknown to hardly anyone in the West, check this out: $800 million is what Ukraine has gotten from Russia for the transit fees that have gone on in the last 12 months. They estimated at about $800 million. Zalinsky wants to shut that off because he says, yeah, but the Russia is also gaining some of it. So I would rather cut off my own nose to spite you so that you don't get the money from the sale of the oil at all. But you see that Fico has a different perspective. He understands things a little bit closer to reality on the ground, as his former foreign minister said recently.
Ukraine, he traveled to Moscow. And for me, it is absolutely ununderstandable move by him, which only confirms a very much changed attitude of his government of Prime Minister Fico, who is basically politically saying that Ukraine has no chance winning this war, that at the end of the day, Ukraine will have to abandon its territory, and basically where Prime Minister Fico is criticizing Western European allies and members of European Union and NATO for providing military support, which he interprets only prolongs the war.
So you see, he might as well have been watching Daniel Davis Deep Dive. We've been saying that since this channel has been on the air. There is no path to a military success. You're not going to hold on, or you're not only not going to hold on to your territory that you have, you're never going to be able to take back what the Russians have already taken. That's just the reality. That's combat reality. It's manpower reality. It's diplomatic reality. It's economic reality, production reality. I mean, you just can't wash all that away, no matter how much you want. And of course, without ever explaining anything or having any bit of shame, you've had Zalinsky, who in the course of this year has gone from just adamant, fist pounding on the desk, we're going to win this war, we have a victory plan, and we're going to take back everything to the 1991 borders. Now all of a sudden says, well, we're going to have a negotiated settlement, but it's going to be through our terms. We have to show Russia that we have strength, and they'll be compelled to have negotiated settlement on our terms. That is irrational, folks. Let's just call this what it is. Upon what basis can you say that you recognize that it was ludicrous to ever say you're going back to the 1991 borders? That was proven to you unambiguously in the entire calendar year of 2023, when your forces that you sent on a massive scale to try and drive Russia out spectacularly failed and have been on the defensive ever since that time. That should be proof enough. But then to just say, without any kind of embarrassment, that now you're shifted to saying, okay, well, I couldn't win on the battlefield, I couldn't drive them out of their territory, but now that I'm just going to say that I want to negotiate a settlement on my terms. Can you explain to me any terms that you can imagine that he's going to find, Zalinsky, that thatched area is going to go to Russia, or even that the current line, that he's going to somehow say, okay, we'll take the current line of contact. That'll be the end. And I'll negotiate and I'll show them this is the strength. Can you imagine Zalinsky going back and saying that's a victory to his people? That's a success. I mean, they would say, wait a minute, why did we fight in 2023? Why did we sacrifice hundreds of thousands of men in all of these cities? And why are we still defending these cities like Pokrovsk to this day, or Velika Novoselka, other ones that are about to fall, Karakova, etc.? Why are we still fighting and dying over blocks in this city when you're about to give away all this stuff? I mean, it doesn't make any sense at all. And Robert Fico is taking huge hit for this, but you can tell that he has calculated, you can hit here, but he sees where this is going. He realizes it can only end one way. So he is probably, if he continues down this path, probably going to be received quite well in Slovakian history, because he recognized early and limited the damage to his country, because he's the leader of Slovakia. So he's looking out for the interest of Slovakia. And if the rest of the European Union wants to go down a destructive, self-defeating path, I guess he can't help that. And they're throwing lots of rocks at him too, by the way, many other members of the European Union. But one that's not throwing rocks at him is his fellow, which we've highlighted here many times, because more than anyone, he gets it and has taken lots of personal courage and lots of action, as he was the rotating head of the European Commission, Viktor Orban, who also has said, who also visited Moscow, who visited Zalinsky, who has talked to leaders of the European Union, and he has emphatically said, and here a couple of days ago, he said something that I think is designed to say, look, take the emotion out of it, folks. Just look at graphically what we have, quote, won with our actions here. First of all, he talks about this in this interview that was on Hungarian media, where he says, this is just the beginning. America and Europe together have spent some 300 billion euros on the war. With this money, a rapid rise in living standards could have been achieved throughout Europe. We could have brought the whole Balkans up to the level of European development. We could have curbed migration. We could have built a completely new European defense system. But this money was burned. And then he shifts his set, from talking about we could have taken that much money and done tremendous, wonderful things that all of us could have benefited from. And by the way, he doesn't talk about it here, but you can add into that. If we had kept the gas lines open, our economic productivity would be better and our profits would be higher because the cost of the gas would have been much, much lower than what it is now. Just add that in there. But then he says, what was the money used on? He said it was burned. 1/5 of Ukraine's territory was occupied. Hundreds of thousands of people died, crippled and injured. Hundreds of thousands more were left widowed and orphaned. Meanwhile, millions have fled Ukraine. Millions, by the way, who almost certainly will never come back, whose infrastructure, transport, and energy systems have been destroyed, and the country is unable to sustain itself economically as far as the eye can see. Now, that is as close to being pragmatically, quantifiably true as anything any European leader has said, most especially in the West, Joe Biden. He has continued to say, we're going to help him as long as it takes. You have Keir Starmer. You have, the leader in Schultz in Germany, even to some extent, Meloni there in Italy, and certainly Macron in France. I mean, they have always continued to say all this fiction that was no doubt hatched in Washington, and then reiterated Jens Stoltenberg when he was the Secretary General. The current Mark Rutte just continues on without hesitation or pause. It just angers me to see some recent clips of Rutte with meeting with Zalinsky, and he had this huge smile on his face and patting him on the back like they're going to a victory celebration or something. Not that what Viktor Orban just described there in graphic detail is actually behind all these backslapping and happy images where the country is burning while they're talking all these happy talk. Now, you just honestly, be honest with yourself, from Robert Fico and Viktor Orban, and then all of the other Western leaders, all of them, NATO leaders, European Union leaders, American leaders, just add in the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, add those guys specifically in. Just imagine things you've heard them say. All of them to this one side and those two over here. Which version of what they say matches closer to the ground? What's true on the ground? And who is being honest and who is not? Now, the answer is self-evident. If the view of these two men is more right than the entire accumulated leadership on the entire rest of the West by these guys, who do you want to listen to on how to reach negotiated settlement? If you're Donald Trump about to come into office, who do you want to listen to? Viktor Orban, Robert Fico, or any of the entire panoply of Western leaders? If you want to succeed, you'll be listening to them. Those two guys right there have the reality and the political courage to say the truth. And they've taken a lot of heat for it. Orban's taken a lot of heat in the European Union. But he has clearly said, all right, I'm going to take this heat now because I think he knows, Robert Fico knows, that on the other side of this, they are going to be vindicated and validated. And their countries are going to probably be rising faster than all the others because they have mitigated some of the harm to their own countries as a result, not the least of which is their defensive capacity. Pardon me. But here's one of the things to note as we get ready to close here is that those are the leaders, but the people are starting to figure this out too. Now, not just you guys who are watching this, who we're very grateful for, and other shows like ours that are willing to tell the truth of what it is. And people are starting to know. And now that that's starting to translate into action on the ground and polling, which usually moves politicians. Here from TVP recently is a report on both the Polish public opinion as well as other people in Europe.
As the war in Ukraine grinds on, societal moods in Poland and across the region are shifting. Recent polls suggest that a growing number of Poles support an end to the war, even if it means territorial concessions. Meanwhile, Western leaders are softening their rhetoric, emphasizing negotiations over open-ended support.
And the same is true, get this, in Ukraine. Look at the polling. You can Google this. Ukraine even has had a significant shift on recognizing this. My friend had a snapshot that he sent me from some of his sources on the front. The men fighting it are recognizing it. And listen, we just keeping it real here. If Zalinsky keeps going down the path he's at of just categorically obliterating truth and ignoring anything he doesn't like and keeping talking like things are going well and they're going to succeed, it's not out of reason to think that his own people might not turn against him and rise up in a new Maidan kind of situation. Because just imagine if you're a family member, a wife, a son, a mother, a father of these kids that are being taken into war and thrown into almost suicide. How much longer are you going to be passive about letting this fiction go on when it's going to cost your own son? Because those days are starting to come to an end, and the anger is rising. Right now, it's this feeling of defeat and despondency. But if that goes too far, that can quickly turn to anger and action, and something they're going to have to be careful about. Yeah, Gary has that headline right there where you see this. They want a quick negotiated end. They don't want to fight for another year to get that thatched area there. They don't want to do it. And folks, I said it could go on that long. Theoretically, it could, because you see the fortifications. You see how long it took Russia to get through the previous set of fortifications. All those things are true. But that also it talks about, or doesn't factor in something that is an unknown that I can't predict. I can't. No one can. And that is, at what point does that fabric finally break and tear, and then shred? And now all of a sudden the army itself just ceases to exist. It can no longer fight. That could come next week. It could come in a month from now, maybe 3 months from now. It's hard to imagine that the entire armed forces of the Ukraine would continue month after month to be willing to fight and suffer horrible casualties and continue to lose territory until there is no more army. At some point, they're going to say, forget this. I'm done. And then all of a sudden the war can just come to a collapsing end right away. I mean, it certainly happened to Russia in the past. That's why the Tsar fell in the 1917 revolution. They finally reached a breaking point, and then he ended up losing his life. It's happened many times before in human history. It's not at all certain that that's not going to be Zalinsky's position if he doesn't change pretty quick. Bottom line to this, folks, is Russia is very clearly signaling what they're willing to do, and they have the capacity to carry this through. You have some in the West who recognize it. You have some people, a lot of people in the West who recognize it. The question is going to be, does Donald Trump recognize it? Is he willing to take also some political courage to do some actions that will actually help the West, will help what's left of Ukraine, and will help all of Europe? Because everyone, folks, listen to me, everybody in the West will benefit by the end of this war. This fear mongering and fiction that Russia is going to win this and also they're going to roll to the West has always been manufactured by the West to scare their populations into continuing to support something that can't succeed. If Trump succeeds in getting this thing negotiated by whatever means, everybody in the West will benefit from it. Well, nearly everyone. Arms makers may not. And that's one of the big dangers, because they have resources to keep the fear mongering going. But as long as we have a channel like this and others like us, we're going to keep telling you the truth. And I think more and more people are starting to come to see it. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'll keep on this, and we'll continue to give you the truth. We are unambiguous and uncompromised on bringing it to you, no matter what it is. And we'll go through this the longest ways. Once Trump gets in, we'll continue to keep you updated on what the possibilities are, what the actions are, and what the meanings of things that may happen. And we'll keep you updated on them. Thank you very much. We'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.